Welcome to our next installment of the Delgado reading series. We have with us Elizabeth Miki Brina today, who will be reading from her debut memoir, and the lovely Phyllis Dunham, who will be introducing her.
Liz, I gotta say, I wonder how um, a person of your limited braggadocio is faring on this virtual book tour thus far. This has
It,
got to be difficult in a lot of ways.
yeah, it's very overwhelming, but I'm really I'm moved by all the responses. It's been but this is fun. This is home. So I'm excited about this one. Yeah.
Well, on the way to the doctor's office this morning, I caught a little bit. They did a bump of your interview with Susan Larson.
Oh, they did? Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
And I got to hear you, and I thought, damn, she's good at this.
Wow.
So
Okay, that's good
I
to
thought
hear.
you sounded great, and you were so you. So with that, I just want to say that Liz and I have known each other since I think 2014. I'm pretty sure was when we were first in Randy Bates's nonfiction workshop at UNO. And I was intrigued by Liz from the beginning. Um, I I just was intrigued because she seemed so strong and fragile simultaneously. So I found that fascinating. And then one evening, she had sent us ahead of time a piece of memoir that she had written, and the title was Risabisu, which was how her Okinawan mother pronounced her name Elizabeth. And it was such a touchingly, provocatively honest piece that it blew my mind. It really did. And I think that's what I like best about Liz as a writer, is she doesn't just sound honest. She's not trying to achieve honest. She's just being honest. And that level of authenticity is rare. There's no fronting. So I don't have higher praise than that for a writer. I just don't. So I'm thrilled you're here, and I hope you'll enjoy her work for those reasons as much as I do. Go ahead.
Thank you, Phyllis. I also want to say that Phyllis was a few years ahead of me in the program and had just this very intimidating reputation for being a really great writer, and she is. And her compliments were gold to me. It meant a lot. So thank you for all your support from the beginning. And thank you everyone for being here. I'm so excited about this. Thank you, Sean, for putting it together. And I guess I'll start. I'm reading. I'm just going to read from the first chapter because so I don't have to introduce it and give it context. There's a bit of an excerpt of it online, but then I'll continue forward, and so you'll get some new stuff. This chapter is called "Worse Than the Dog," and it starts off with a quote. I asked my dad why all the great stories were sad ones. Most good stories are mysteries, he said. The author is like a detective trying to get to the bottom of some truth, and happiness is a misery that can come apart in your hands when you try to unravel it. Sadness, on the other hand, is infinitely more resilient. Scrutiny only adds to its depth and weight. This is Bliss Broyard from My Father's Daughter, and then my chapter begins. My first memory: a dog bites me on the arm, not hard, but just enough to jar me into consciousness. His name is Shiro, which means white or castle or generation in Japanese, depending on how it is written. Shiro has long white hair, blue eyes, and a grayish pink nose. I am 3 years old and he is just above my height, but I can still look him in the eyes. I believe we understand each other, our arrangement. I believe at age 3, I've earned his subservience. He carries himself proudly, majestic, like a horse. So one day, when no one else is around, in the backyard, beside the cinder block fence, as he lowers his head to drink from a shiny porcelain bowl of water, I try to mount him. He growls and bites me. He doesn't frighten me. He embarrasses me, shames me. And as a small child, an only child, accustomed to endless doting, I wouldn't tolerate these strange emotions. I cry and run to my mother. I don't tell her why I'm crying. I'm afraid that if I tell her, she'll scold me worse than the dog did. Shiro is not to be ridden like a horse. Shiro is my Oba-san's dog. Oba, my grandmother, my mother's mother, found Shiro when he was still a puppy, eyes closed, curled up into a ball, quivering on a pile of garbage. Often at night, Oba pushed the cart through the streets of Kadena, a town located on the island of Okinawa, where my mother was born and raised, where I lived for 6 months when I was 3 years old. Often at night, when the air thinned and cooled, when the sounds of jets, helicopters, and gunfire coming from the nearby military bases quieted, Oba pushed a cart through the streets and rummaged through trash heaps, searching for cans and bottles to sell, scraps of wood and metal to reuse. She lived in a house with a rusted tin roof, a rusted tin gate, a floor raised from the mud by cinder blocks, with a single room for cooking, eating, drinking, sleeping, and playing cards, a backyard for bathing and growing sweet potatoes, which she ate for every meal. She lived almost all her life in this house, the house where my mother grew up, the house my grandfather built after their previous house was destroyed during the Battle of Okinawa. That is how most of us have heard of Okinawa, but as a battle fought and won and quickly disregarded, not as a battle on which our entire contemporary history depends, from which we are still recovering. It began in April of 1945 and lasted 82 days. In Japanese, the battle is referred to as Tetsu no Ame. In English, the phrase means rain of steel. The Okinawans simply refer to it as Okinawan no Sensho, Okinawan War. Although a conquered nation for many centuries, first as a tributary of China, then as a colony of Japan, Okinawa had never known such carnage. For 82 days, thousands of planes dropped hundreds of thousands of bombs on the island, crushing and burning countless creatures, plants, houses, and buildings. For 82 days, hundreds of thousands of troops invaded the island, wielding tanks and guns, throwing grenades, and shooting into hiding places. 140,000 Okinawans, a third of the population, were killed. That does not account for all those who died of injury, illness, starvation after the battle. That does not account for all those who were forced to commit suicide. Of those killed, some were conscripted soldiers called boitai, boys as young as 12, ordered to fight in the front lines. Some were nurses or members of relief teams called gyutai, girls as young as 14, ordered to cook and tend to the wounded. The rest were civilians, 120,000 civilians who died in a war they didn't choose, sacrificed to protect Japan, the precious mainland. Many Okinawans believe that those who died had died in vain, or rather, what they refer to as a dog's death, inujini. When news spread that Okinawa would soon be attacked, Oba was living by herself with her 4 children, my mother's older brother and older 3 sisters. My grandfather, conscripted 4 years earlier, was somewhere in Korea being held prisoner. When the sirens blared days before the troops landed, before the ships could be seen from shore, Oba and her 4 children, her son, age 4, and her 3 daughters, ages 3, 5, and 7, grabbed sacks of potatoes they had been gathering and storing for months. They hid in caves while the ground shook with each explosion, while their island, their home, crumbled and turned to ash. They fled from cave to cave while their sacks emptied, while their clothes loosened and unraveled from their shrinking bodies. For 2 years after the war, they wandered from camp to camp, slept in tents or under tarps. They bathed in the ocean. They ate what they could scavenge. They collected rain and drew from low, muddy wells for drinking. When my grandfather returned from Korea, he was a different person. He returned, but he was gone. Somehow Oba kept herself and her 4 children alive and unharmed through one of the most horrific battles in history, a story I wish she could have told me. Yet these memories are impossible to forget, regardless of whether we actually live through them. I believe they stay in our bodies as sickness, as addiction, as poor posture, or a tendency toward apology, as a deepened capacity for sadness or anger, as determination to survive, a relentless tempered optimism. I believe they are inherited, passed on to us like brown eyes or the shape of a nose. I had not learned this history, my mother's history, my history, until I was 34 years old, which is to say that I grew up not knowing my mother or myself. 3 years after the war, my mother was born. She was born into poverty and chaos. She was born into a family, an entire people stunned by violence and grief. When my mother was born, Okinawa was still considered an enemy territory. This meant that the occupying US military was under no obligation to restore the battered landscape, and Okinawa was still a vast ruin of decay and rubble. This meant that the occupying US military guarded and patrolled the wreckage of the island, and Okinawans relied on bare subsistence rations of bread and milk, cans of red chili, popcorn, and candy. Some of the troops gave the prettiest girls bright new clothes to wear and called them honeys. Some of the troops broke into homes, robbed and raped Okinawans inside homes because there were no laws against it, no laws at all. In 1952, 3 years after my mother was born, around the age she would have formed her first memory, Japan officially relinquished rule of Okinawa to the United States. My mother witnessed the US military devouring the island, constructing immense complexes of bases. She witnessed forests and fields, wetlands and beaches becoming concrete. She witnessed farmers and fishermen, carpenters and potters, cooks and shopkeepers becoming mere labor. Her brothers were hired to help build the bases. Her sisters were hired to serve food in the cafeterias. Oba cleaned barracks. My grandfather also cleaned barracks, but mostly he just stayed in bed. Oh my gosh. Sorry. Let me try this. I'm so sorry. That's the worst thing. There we go. My grandfather also cleaned barracks, but mostly he just stayed in bed, too sick with grief, humiliation, and alcoholism to do much of anything else. For many years after the war, in order to supplement her income, Oba cooked breakfast and lunch for a few of her neighbors. A couple of them were orphans, older than our youngest children, old enough to work, but still needing someone to care for them. She cooked on a portable gas stove while they drank tea and played cards in the same room. They paid her $1 to sit on her floor and eat food she prepared, not much, just potato and broth. Not long after her own children moved out and moved away, after my grandfather gambled and drank himself to death, Oba found Shiro on a pile of garbage and brought him to her home. She held him like a baby and fed him with a bottle. Then he grew older and bigger, and they would sit together at the same table, which was already low to the floor, perfect for a dog, and share from the same bowl. One piece of potato for her, one piece for him. She would slurp some broth and give the rest to him, back and forth for every meal. Shiro trotted beside her as Oba pushed a cart through the streets. Shiro was not to be ridden like a horse. My first memory of Shiro biting me is all I remember of the time I lived in Okinawa. There are many photographs of my aunts and uncles holding me and smiling, my cousins holding me and smiling, Oba carrying me on her back and smiling. We are not just posing for photographs. We are smiling because we are happy. I am a small child, and I don't know what sadness is yet, and therefore I make everyone happy. There is a photograph of me at a beach, lying on my stomach on the sand, wearing a red and white polka dotted swimsuit and sunglasses much too large for my face. I am laughing, probably because the person behind the camera is laughing. There's a photograph of me in the park, standing on a pair of giant bronze statue boots, each boot bigger than my whole body, wearing berets and bow-shaped barrettes in my hair, arms crossed and brow furrowed, trying to look tough, probably because the person behind the camera is showing me how to look tough and I am mimicking her. We are having fun, pretending and playing together because I am happy and everyone loves to play with me. But I do not remember any of these moments. They are just photographs my mother had taken and framed and hung on walls or put on shelves around the house. They do not belong to my life. They belong to hers. What I do remember is walking through Newark Airport. I am walking with my mother, staying very close to her, holding her hand. A man walks beside us. He smiles a lot and wants to hold my hand too, but I won't let him. I won't let him because I don't know him. I don't remember him because my first memory is of Shiro biting me. My mother tells me the man is my father. She tells me that he stayed behind here where we are now in the United States. She tells me that he was traveling, looking for a better job and a better place for us to live. That is why we had to live with my aunt in Okinawa for 6 months. That is why we have returned. Because the man is my father and her husband. We belong with him. She says, Otosan, Otosan, Anato no Otosan. Father, father, your father. She tells me in Japanese because back then I could understand and speak Japanese. I hold my mother's hand tighter, hiding from him behind her. And for a long time, that is the closest I ever felt to my mother, when I was still in her world. What my mother and I share now is an understanding that precedes words. It is an understanding that comes from being the same body, being fed, bathed, clothed, held in our arms every day, loved every day, then becoming separate, growing apart, then remembering how much that hurt, remembering and being grateful for the distance we traversed, the distance we were able to recover. It is an understanding that comes from forgiveness. My mother and I communicate through layered small talk, subtexted chit chat, a shorthand that took years and years to develop and satisfies our desire to be close. But will that ever compensate for the years and years of silence, for the time we missed, the time I squandered? My mother was born in 1948, 3 years after the war, 3 years after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. She was born and raised in Kadena, the sixth child of a fisherman and a fisherman's wife, both from Miyako, one of the many smaller islands that surround Okinawa. I don't know much about their lives before the war because they were never able to tell me. They were never able to tell my mother. They worked hard with their bodies every day to feed themselves and their children, and when they didn't work, they were too tired to talk to their children about such trifles as their lives when they were younger. My mother quit school before she finished 8th grade. She worked for 50 cents an hour in a factory that manufactured bento boxes until she turned 16, old enough to work at a nightclub as a waitress. She worked as a waitress for the rest of her life, at nightclubs in Okinawa, then at Japanese restaurants in the United States. When she moved to the United States, she dreamed of climbing the social ladder to the status of secretary or accountant, of wearing press suits and blouses and typing reports, but disillusionment quickly settled. She couldn't speak English. She couldn't learn English fast enough, well enough. Working hard with her body was all she knew. Working hard with her body was her rightful place, and the restaurants became her retreat. A backdrop of wood and paper paneled screens, rock ponds filled with koi fish, the strumming of 3-string guitars heard through stereo speakers, which so faintly reminded her of home. She always gave some of her paycheck to her mother and younger sister, even long after she left Okinawa. Sometimes she still gives some of it to her spoiled daughter. According to Japanese legend, if you make 1,000 paper cranes, you are granted 3 wishes. My mother made 1,000 paper cranes once, shortly after she became a waitress. Her 3 wishes were to marry an American who would buy her a big house, and together they would have a child, a daughter, fingers crossed, who could eat as much as she pleased and sleep on a bed in her very own room. My father was born in 1948, 3 years after Victory Day, 3 years after the Cold War commenced. He was born in Brooklyn and raised in Manhattan, the first child of a wealthy Italian immigrant and an English-Irish Scotswoman who could trace her lineage back to Jamestown. My grandfather salvaged a small portion of his family's wealth despite the Great Depression. To prove his loyalty to his new country, he enlisted in the army and swiftly ascended the ranks as a translator. He could speak Italian, Spanish, French, German, and English fluently. He studied philosophy at Columbia University, then founded one of the first telephone answering services in New York City. My grandmother was his receptionist. A recent graduate of Hunter College, 22 years old, 15 years younger than my grandfather when they married. They bought a corner condo on the Upper West Side, where they raised 3 boys. My father and his 2 younger brothers went to Loyola, prestigious Jesuit high school at 88th Street and Park Avenue, not too far from where they lived. My father was taught Latin. He was taught St. Thomas Aquinas. He read every play by Shakespeare, every book by Dickens, Conrad, Hemingway, and Fitzgerald by the time he graduated from Fordham University, another Jesuit institution. After he enlisted in the army, following in the footsteps of his father, He read the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and the State and Revolution by Vladimir Lenin because he sought to understand the mind of the enemy. His exact words. My father became an airborne ranger, a Green Beret, then a captain. He fought in the Vietnam War. He fought to save the Vietnamese from communism, from tyranny. When he returned to the United States, he dreamed of keeping up the good fight, of solving the nation's economic problems, but he couldn't keep a job for very long. There was always a boss to rebuke, a partner to contend with, a devious consumer policy he refused to abide. There was always a layoff, a bankruptcy, a recession, persecution for being a veteran. Eventually, the narrative shifted, and the culprits included the women's movement, affirmative action, and the Jews in charge of Wall Street. I cringe to admit that's what he believes, but that's what he believes. Writing it feels like betrayal because he is my father, and he means so much more to me than his bigotry. My father believes in the code of heroes, of men, of strong men who protect the weak. He believes in honor and sacrifice. If my mother or I asked for anything, needed anything, he would do anything. He wouldn't sleep or eat. He wouldn't stop fighting, wouldn't surrender. I was born in 1981, the year Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as the 40th president, the year MTV began broadcasting. I was born in Elk Grove, a suburb of Chicago, the first and only child of an inspiring entrepreneur and an expatriate. Around the time I was born, my father graduated from Northwestern University with an MBA in operations management, and my mother started taking ELL classes. My mother hated those classes, she confided years later when I became old enough to care enough to ask her. Too hard. I want to stop going, but your father not let me. He make me study. He study with me. He helped me. Good for him, I thought to myself, not yet comprehending the unfairness, the very lopsided power dynamic, not yet aware of the ease with which she conceived and uttered the word let, the ease with which I heard and processed it. We accepted the word without resistance, with a nod of approval. We always listened to my father. We trusted him. Because my father was the parent who knew what to say when I asked about thunder and lightning or jumping off a diving board, about the girls who teased me or the boys who ignored me. He knew what to say to teachers and gymnastics coaches. He knew what to say, and he said it so well. His pronunciation was perfect. Why didn't I learn Japanese? Why didn't my father learn and require me to learn like he required my mother to learn English? Perhaps ethnocentrism is to blame. Perhaps learning a language that wasn't European wasn't very popular in the 1980s. Perhaps my father heeded what the psychologists were claiming at the time, that learning 2 or more languages at once would confuse children. Perhaps he remembered my grandfather, who was fluent in 5 languages but didn't graduate from high school until he was 21 years old. Perhaps my father, as a man, an American man who grew up in the 1950s, couldn't quite empathize, couldn't quite anticipate the isolation of his wife, the strain on the relationship between her and her daughter. Perhaps part of him enjoyed being everything for her, doing everything for her. Or perhaps he tried and failed, or tried and gave up, couldn't surmount the challenge without such a massive imperative, without a spouse and a child and in-laws and friends and neighbors and coworkers and customers and cashiers who understand and speak only English. Even now, as I try to learn, listening to a Pimsleur lesson every day, well, almost every day, sometimes every other day or every other week, for going on 2 years, I can barely utter more than a few words and phrases. It is too hard to retain, to pay attention, to speak, to think and speak in a language that isn't mine, isn't necessary. I am too dependent on English. I am too American. In 1972, Okinawa reverted, or rather was sold back to Japan for the sum of $685 million. The Okinawans who were skeptical held their breath. The Okinawans who were hopeful celebrated. They sang and danced. They marched in parades and waved Japanese flags. They thought they were done with the US military, done with the bases. The bases remain. Since 1972, nearly 9,000 crimes, including murders by shooting, by stabbing, by strangulation, vehicular homicide, theft, arson, rape, sexual assault, have been committed by US military personnel stationed in Okinawa. 169 court-martial cases for sexual assault, a higher record at US military bases than in any other nation, have occurred in Okinawa. Today, 20% of Okinawan landmass is still controlled by the US military, more land controlled by a foreign military than in any other nation. Okinawa became known as R&R Island, a place where troops could relax and recuperate between stints at war. My father was stationed on Okinawa after he fought for 4 years in Vietnam. He met my mother in Kadena, just outside the army base, at a club called the Blue Diamond, where she worked as a waitress, getting paid $1 for every drink she got a serviceman to buy for her. And here is where history becomes mine, alive in me. He sits on a stool. He is strong, confident. He is handsome, movie star handsome, Elvis handsome. He smiles with straight white teeth and flashes a wad of crisp cash. He orders a bourbon on the rocks in a language and accent that signal power. She sits next to him. She is petite, slender. She is beautiful, exotic. She smiles and twirls a few strands of her dark, dark hair, as smooth as silk, flowing down to her waist like water. Is love possible in a place like this, in a situation like this, between two people from separate worlds on opposite sides of war and conquest? I will never know how the story began, only how it ends. Perhaps to someone who had grown up eating sweet potatoes for every meal, sleeping in the same room as her mother, father, and 6 siblings, he must have seemed like a way out. Perhaps to someone who had just spent 4 years in combat, she was too vulnerable to resist. He had to save her. And so, a year later, in 1974, 2 years after the reversion and 1 year before the Vietnam War ended, they married on the island. Marriage to locals was discouraged, but as a commanding officer, my father granted his own approval. It was a small ceremony, only Oba attended. My grandfather was too sick, my uncles were too angry, my aunts were too sad, scared, maybe jealous that their sister was marrying an American, a soldier, that their sister was leaving. Oba managed to scrounge enough money to rent 2 traditional wedding kimonos and hire a photographer to document the event. My mother has seen her mother 3 times in the 45 years since she left. When my mother and I lived in Okinawa, Oba carried me on her back, walked the streets carrying me on her back, and pointed. Ie for house, ki for tree, tori for bird. She taught me how to say tabaru if I was hungry and nomu if I was thirsty. She taught me how to say many words I can't remember. My mother was grateful to spend this time with Oba when neither of them had to work so hard. Back then, she believed she could have both, her life in Okinawa and her life in the United States. Back then, she believed she would return more often, enough to keep these separate worlds, Okinawa and the United States, her mother and her daughter, connected. But even the best intentions dilute from routine and convenience. As I grew up, as I became more and more American, so did my mother. Visits became once a decade and then once every 2 decades. Phone calls became once a month and then once every 3 months. When my mother and I lived in Okinawa, my father looked for a better job and a better place for us to live. A job and a place befitting his expectations and potential. He traveled to Brazil, he traveled to Singapore, he traveled to Tokyo and Osaka, he traveled to Texas and California and Washington, D.C. He was offered a job at the CIA, but was told my mother would be a liability. He declined the offer. My father finally found a job as a management consultant for a financial firm called the Princeton Group. He found a place for us to live in Plainsboro, New Jersey, in a condo and a complex of condos, each building uniformly square, uniformly painted gray and blue, enclosed by parking lots and fences. The complex of condos shared a playground, 2 tennis courts, and a pool. In many ways, it resembled a military base. There was a process, I'm sure, but in my memory, almost immediately, I joined my father's world, a world in which my mother was never entirely welcome, could never fully participate. I remember she dressed up as a clown for Halloween once, but only once. I remember she helped us decorate the Christmas tree, but she wanted to wrap the lights too close around the trunk, not dangling closer to the edges of the branches. I remember an older little girl from the neighborhood flung a shoe at my chest, knocking the wind out of me, and a sharp pebble at my face, slicing the bridge of my nose. I cried and ran to my mother, but she could see I wasn't hurt too badly and did nothing. My father came home from work, and after I told him what had happened, he went on a hunt for this older little girl. He charged through the neighborhood wearing his three-piece suit, searching every alley and alcove of the complex. When he spotted her on the playground, swinging on a tire swing by herself, he yelled at this older little girl until his skin reddened and his veins bulged, until she trembled with terror, until she cried and ran to her mother, and then her mother came pounding on our door, clamoring for an explanation. My father told her that he would have struck this older little girl if she were his own child and if he were a boy. He told her that bullies must be bullied, otherwise they will never learn. My father believed it was his duty to bully the bullies. He possessed an irresistible certainty, the assurance of someone who knew how it felt to do more than survive. He always made me feel safe and protected in his world. We lived in Plainsboro, New Jersey for a year and a half. During that time, my father would travel to Manhattan on business trips for days, sometimes a week. I saw my father on weekends. I ached for missing him. When my father was home, he would take me to the pool and we would swim laps. I clung to his shoulders and his body held me above the water. My mother didn't want to go to the pool. The water was saturated with chemicals and the neighbors showered after, not before, they swam in the pool. The neighbors asked my mother to repeat herself, which annoyed her and seemed to frighten her, and her fear scared me too. She didn't belong. That meant I didn't either. My father would watch Bugs Bunny cartoons with me. We sat on the couch together, eating carrots whole as if they were plucked from the ground. My mother would peel and slice the carrots. She couldn't understand why I preferred to eat the carrots whole like an animal. My father would sit in a chair beside my bed and read to me until I fell asleep. My mother couldn't understand why I was so afraid of the dark, so afraid of this giant empty room that I was lucky enough to have all to myself. Sometimes I would cry and cry from missing my father, and my mother would have to calm at work because only his voice calmed me. His voice. The voice that read Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, The Ugly Duckling, and The Velveteen Rabbit to me whenever I asked, and so often I had memorized the words. I remember one day when I was 4 years old, I asked my mother to read these stories with me. I wanted her to listen and watch. I wanted to show off. We sat on the floor of my bedroom with the book spread between us. I recited the words and turned the pages. You don't need me, my mother said, bitter and accusing. I didn't bother to deny it. Even at that age, we both knew it was true. I spent most of that year and a half with my mother, but my recollections of her are vague. She was a ghost who suddenly appeared in rooms, carrying a stack of carefully folded laundry or pushing a vacuum. She swept and mopped the floors, scrubbed the countertops, while I played with dolls that didn't look anything like me and looked even less like her. She bought me a Marico doll, the Asian-looking Barbie doll, but I was not amused. She taught me how to fold paper into the shape of a bird. Sometimes my mother got very drunk. She would call her mother and sisters in Okinawa, talk on the phone for hours, then hang up and burst into tears. For a long time, I thought my mother was weak because she couldn't speak English very well or read, because she was afraid of pools and neighbors, because she got drunk and sobbed unconsolably and had to be carried, sometimes dragged to bed. I didn't realize then that she couldn't change history, that history wasn't her fault, that she could never escape the legacy of defeat, of trauma, perpetuated by her very own husband and daughter, that I could never escape either. Now, whenever I try to comprehend her loneliness, I am completely overwhelmed by her strength. She must have longed for that small child in the photographs. She must have ached for missing me. My mother told me I used to understand and speak Japanese. She told me that after we returned to the United States, she would speak to me in Japanese, and at first I responded, but then I stopped answering, and then eventually I stopped listening. Everywhere around me, English. Everywhere around my mother, English. I adapted, she could not, so I abandoned her. My mother told me Oba came to live with us for 2 months when I was 4 years old. She was supposed to come live with us permanently, but the United States, even just the sliver of it called Plainsboro, New Jersey, was too big and cruel for her. I remember Oba took me to the pool. She wore a flimsy, floral printed button-down shirt and a skirt and white sandals with white socks. She looked so odd and out of place in my world. She sat on a plastic lawn chair at the edge of the pool while I swam by myself in the shallow end and ignored her because she couldn't speak English, because she was old and wrinkled, from pushing a cart through the streets and rummaging through trash heaps, from watching a husband gamble and drink himself to death, from watching a daughter die of pneumonia, a daughter die of cancer, and another daughter move far away to another world. I wish I could have made her feel more welcome back then. Please stay with us, Oba, I would have said. My mother needs you. I need you. Teach me Japanese. I imagined poor Shiro for those 2 months while Oba was with us, probably eating outside with the other dogs. Shiro died shortly after Oba returned to Okinawa, and Oba never returned to the United States. And that's the end.
Does anybody have any questions?
That was really good. That was like beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you very much. How are we doing on time? Oh, I was reading for a good bit, wasn't I? I can feel it in my throat.
You have as much time as you like. There's no rush.
Yeah, I was hoping that everybody felt what I felt when I first heard this vein of your writing, which was, damn, that's honest. I mean, it's just out there and very, very real. And it is not an attempt to flatter yourself or your family or the reader. And I just have so much respect for that.
Thank you, Phyllis.
Thank you. I can't buy the book myself and read it again and read it very slowly.
Oh, good.
And let my daughter read it as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
When would that book be released?
It's out now. It came out on Tuesday, so you can get it wherever you buy your books.
Someone actually just put it in the chat, so you can go straight to the link.
Oh, good.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, thank you, Corey. Remember your local bookstores. Octavia.
But for the record, congratulations. You've done an amazing job.
Thank you, Raquel. Thank you. Thanks, Kathy. I wish I could read that, but I can't. Also, anyone who speaks Japanese, I'm very self-conscious about. I don't even try to pronounce it like as a Japanese person. I think I would just fumble over it. So I just pronounce it like English.
Are you living here now?
Yep, I live in New Orleans. Yeah.
So, Liz, are you able to get back to Rochester much? Do you spend much time with your family up there, or do they come down here?
They haven't been here in a really long time, and I went up to Rochester for Christmas. I broke the rules. But I had to see them.
Well, whose rules?
Oh, the COVID rules,
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, I rented a car and drove up there, and I thought that was going to be a safer way, but then I was thinking, I'm like, all the bathrooms and the gas stations and the 2 hotels, I'm like, I should have just flown. What was I doing? But yeah, but I definitely they're going to try to get vaccinated so that they can fly here. So.
Well, one of the things that I think of as a writer, and I don't really have your courage to write about family to this day. I really don't. And both my parents are gone now. And I think I thought as a younger writer, I thought, well, maybe someday when they're gone, I can be really honest about this. And you just did it while they were still alive. How has that affected your relationships with them?
I think it definitely helped me understand both of them a lot more. My mother, it's definitely healed my relationship with my mother. My mother and I are very close. Just from writing this book and asking her all these questions, that I got to get to know her through writing this. So that's been really special. And my father and I have always been close, but I think it's a little harder for him because he's kind of knocked from his pedestal a little bit. And I think that's been tough. And he takes that too as like, what was happening individually in her family was also happening in the world too, right? Like with the white man. So it, like, you know what I mean? Like I think it felt like a lot for him. It was tough, but he's amazing. Like he's very, he's a very kind, empathetic man. They haven't read the book yet. So the plan is for my dad to read the book to my mom. So that'll be very interesting. I'm glad I'll be 1,000 miles away when that happens.
Well, maybe when it's translated into Japanese, she can read it on her own.
Yeah, that would be nice. Yeah, that'd be great.
Because I kind of think that might happen.
Oh, I hope so.
Yeah. The research that you did is pretty intense and amazing. And I can see this as a healing journey. Just learning that history had to have just opened up buckets of empathy for your mom. And did you enjoy the research? I mean, it's one of my favorite parts of writing, but it's not everybody's.
At first I didn't. I didn't know where to begin. There's so much. And then the first book I read, it was what I could find. It was this history of Okinawa from prehistoric times to World War II, like through the Battle of Okinawa. And I'm very, very grateful for this book. It was 500 pages, and I'm so glad that someone wrote it. But it was like tough to get through. But then because it was very academic, and that's where I started, and a lot more like sociological and anthropological studies. And then I finally stumbled upon memoirs that were translated into English, memoirs of people, and then it started to feel very real and close.
So
and what's that?
It's inspired. So it was like inspired from a memoir. Like
So this is my memoir. This is my family history, but all the Okinawan history is very inspired by other memoirs, because I couldn't there isn't a whole lot of history out there, like texts on Okinawan history out there, and that's one of the that was one of the problems, right? Is growing up not knowing this history. And I learned much of the history from the memoirs. And someone, I saw someone asked, I haven't been following the chat, but I did see someone ask if my parents were still together. And yes, 45 years. So they're, you know, they made it. I don't know.
Hey, Elizabeth,
Hi,
great
Andrew.
job.
Thank you.
I'm curious about your thoughts on the genre American memoir. And to kind of like frame my question, I'll explain that my English 102 class is reading Kiese Layman's Heavy right now. And thinking about him today, and he was talking about the need for memoir to be a story of deliverance or like progress, at least in the American genre. And then, hey, what's up to all the English 102 kids in the house? Hey everyone. But what are your thoughts on American as a genre? How did that like influence your writing process? For asking a question, I don't know.
Just memoir as a genre?
Yeah, and specifically like an American memoir. Like, I don't know.
I never thought of it like it's just like an American memoir. Well, I mean, there's a lot. Memoir as a genre. I just didn't know like any other way to write. I didn't know how to. I don't know how to fictionalize things. I don't know. Anytime I tried to write something that is not real, I'm completely stumped. Like I need, it's just how my mind works is like from memories, or I need some material that's already out there. Yeah, I think memoir, it's about, I don't know, I kind of think of it as like I'm just trying to explain myself, right? Like I'm just trying to explain myself to myself, and then also I'm trying to like say I'm also asking for like I'm claiming these experiences my own, and I'm like asking for judgment, right? Like I'm saying like this is something this was my life, and this is what I did and why I did the things that I did, and like, you know, what do you think, right? Like what's your verdict on it? So in a lot of ways it's like it's like it's for redemption. Yeah.
I get it.
And I imagine that to be the case with in particular with American memoirs, right? Because Americans like have a lot needing to be redeemed. So
Yeah, you said something interesting in your interview with Susan Larson. You said in some ways you were trying to explain why you were such a crappy daughter. Or mean daughter, I think you said. Why I was so mean to my mother.
Right. Yeah. That's what it is. It's like I did this. This is why I did this. I'm sorry. Like, you know what I mean? Like please forgive me. Kind of a thing. So it's and I think of it too as a way to make it all kind of like mean something, or make it all worthwhile, like that
yeah.
So Liz, oh, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
Liz, how long did it take you to write it? You know, like when did you decide that you were going to start writing this, and you know, and then how long until completion?
I started, I mean, it was I actually started writing pieces that would become that would go into this book maybe in before I knew it was going to be a book, right? in 2014. So like it started in my workshops at UNO, and I didn't know, like, but at that point I didn't know it was going to be a book. I didn't know it was going to be a book until a year later. That's when I thought, well, actually it was Randy, my professor Randy Bates, who I had turned in something to workshop, and he was like, "This is your book." So like, what, really? Okay. Because before that I was writing a lot of I was writing about, in the workshops, I was very scared of this topic, and I also didn't think that anyone would be very interested in it. Like, I was like, no one wants to hear about my heritage, or like my drunk mom, like, you know what I mean, like not to be too light about it, but um and then I was just shying away from it. I was writing about like drugs and breakups, which is like a lot of things that new writers write about. And then I finally yeah, I got the courage, and then that's when Randy was like, "This is it, like, stay here." So yeah,
Awesome.
that was in 2015. Mhm.
Okay.
Mhm.
I have a question.
Yes.
Was you like upset when you first like started learning about the stuff because you was so young? Well, before you was born, but when you was young, everything that was going on. Was you upset at first?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Very. It was very. It was tough. Lots of sleepless nights and some crying. And I was also really, like, just even the history of it too. I was very I was just angry for having lived so long not knowing it. You know, like, I don't know why any of us allowed that to happen. You know,
Right.
so thank you.
Do you have any more readings coming up
Yeah,
on this digital book
I
tour?
I have like a one that's at Octavia, where I'm like it's in conversation with Randy Bates, my old professor. Not old, like, you know, my former my former professor. And that's the only reading it. Like, the rest I have are so far like radio shows, so more interviews.
When and where is that? That's at Octavia.
Yeah,
What's the date?
that's March 2nd.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so that's online or in real
Yep.
space? Or?
It's online. It's
Okay.
online. Mhm.
And how do we get there?
You can go how do you get there? Why don't I know this? I think you can look it up on their website. It's a requirement to buy the book, to participate in the virtual tour. So I don't know, I feel bad because I asked him, like, well, what about the people who already bought it? And he's like, okay. So but I'm happy that he's hosting it. But yeah, it is one of those, maybe he'll drop it like after at a certain point, and he'll just let anyone hoping he'll make it open to the public. So
I have one other question for you. Are you prepared to be the most popular writing coach at Delgado?
No. But no, that's yeah, there's plenty of amazing coaches, so I'm not
Ain't
worried.
that the truth? What a
I'm not
crew.
worried. Yeah.
An amazingly talented bunch, if I do say so myself.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thanks, Dan, for putting the link up.
I knew somebody would.
Yeah.
That's great.
Mhm.
Well, I just want to thank you. I have to go pick up my son from work now. So I'm
Okay.
gonna
Yeah.
check me out. But I want to thank you for doing this. I know it's not particularly easy for you. It's just fun to watch you relax when you're being asked about the work, and not so fun to watch you freeze up when it's about promoting.
Yeah.
This
Yeah,
is
I guess
fun.
I gotta get better at that, right?
Well, I don't
Just
know.
sell
I
books.
think the warmth and the authenticity that you exude is what makes you interesting as a writer. And I don't want to see you lose that. It's okay.
Thank you.
There'll always be somebody. Dan, thank you for putting up the website. I mean, for putting up the URL. So
Uh-huh.
you continue to do what you do. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. This has been great. This is amazing. Thank you.
Great job, Sean.
Yay.
Yay, Sean. I'm gonna head out.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Liz.
I love that book.
Thank you. Oh,
Thank you,
great.
Liz.
Thank you. Oh, that was Corey. Thank you.
Bye.
I was like, who said that? Thanks so much. Thank you, everyone. Bye.